We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides and Tim Donner. Tim, so give me your view from 30,000 feet. Although maybe we shouldn't be using airplane metaphors in recent days.
Yes, I can understand that. Well, it struck me in watching the speech that Democrats now know what it's like to go to a MAGA rally. Because, of course, it was highly partisan, especially at the beginning. And, of course, none of those people would ever go near a MAGA rally. But now they get a sense of how Trump can whip people into a frenzy with his language, with his with his soaring rhetoric, and then his pointed criticism and attacks on the people who tried to throw him in jail, bankrupt him, and of course, ultimately, there were 2 attempts to assassinate him.
Yes, not to mention the overarching goal was to stop him returning to office.
Yes.
All of these things
at any cost. And, it was said long ago, and you'll know, I think, who said it, but I'm not sure. It said, if you shoot at the king, you better not miss.
I don't know who said that, but it's a great quote.
Okay. If you shoot at the king, you better not miss. And what they've done is shoot at this particular king for the last decade, especially in the run-up to the 2024 election. And not just literally, but figuratively, they tried to shoot the king and they missed. And when you miss shooting the king, you will experience his wrath to a degree that's almost unimaginable.
Yes, they took their shot, they blew it. I mean, this in the figurative sense,
yes.
Sending him to prison or derailing his campaign. And they blew it completely. And it seems to me that they weren't prepared for that. And that's why we're seeing so much floundering now, because what's the best way to put this? They started believing their own narrative. The people on the left, they came up with this idea that Donald Trump, he's a criminal, he's terrible, he's a quasi-fascist. And they started believing it. And they started believing what they were telling the friendly news anchors, because, of course, the mainstream media, the legacy media, more rightly so, weren't pushing back on their claims that Donald Trump's a threat to democracy. And so they thought there's no way he can win. And then he won. And then he's doing everything that he said he was going to do in the campaign. And they didn't expect those 2 things. One, they didn't expect him to actually win. 2, they didn't expect him to do what he said he was going to do. And that's political naivety of the most egregious kind, Tim.
Yes, they said to themselves, of course, the country isn't going to elect this guy again. And I think, frankly, Mark, January 6th of 21 had quite a bit to do with it. They figured that they could just play the January 6th footage in a loop, and that would be enough to horrify the American people. But just to make sure, they would trump up charges in 4 different legal venues to try and throw him into jail. People could see that the charges were trumped up, unprecedented use of legal maneuvers to make something reasonably innocent seem like it was felonious. And, they did that just to be sure. And every time they piled on, whether it was the case in New York or in Georgia or from Jack Smith at the federal level, they just worsened their case, and they made Trump that much more a subject of, if not empathy, at least sympathy from people, American people who would ordinarily not have been sympathetic towards him, but saw the basic unfairness of the whole thing. And then, of course, there's the results of the Biden administration. And once you had a head-to-head comparison between what Trump actually did as president and what Biden and Harris actually did as president, the choice was not hard for the American people.
I think it comes down to one thing. America was, as a nation, was born as the underdog against essentially the greatest power the world had known at that time, against Britain. And it was
Still
the underdog.
sorry about that, Mark. Sorry
Yeah,
about
we will let you go. It's all right.
248 years ago.
So it America was born as an underdog, and America loves that story. They love the underdog story, and what they managed to do by prosecuting him, by demonizing him in every venue possible, they took the guy who was president of the United States and they made him the underdog against Kamala Harris. And I think that was what cost them. Final word on that, Tim, from you.
Well, I think I'll go back to what you said. They started to believe their own headlines. They started to believe, because of the reinforcement of mass media, that Trump was a threat to democracy without actually
Mm.
describing in what way he was. They still are doing that. In the Elisa Slotkin response
Mm.
to the State of the Union, she talked again about democracy and the threat to democracy, and it's so important. But she really was empty rhetoric. And right now, while Trump has done more in 7 weeks than Joe Biden probably did in a lifetime, and certainly in 4 years in the Oval Office, the Democrats appear to be clueless and not knowing what to do or how to respond. There's a gulf of America between the Republicans and Democrats right now.
And may it be named forever so. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for today on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guest, longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner. And of course, thank you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in each week and join us for the show. Please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.